And we're going to be talking about changes in the 510K. The key takeaway here is you have to determine whether a change to either the device or the software in the device or firmware is significant, and significant primarily based on patient risk. We'll talk about that as we go through here. We'll talk a little bit about the old K97-1 model and how it's been updated. The FDA attempted to update it a few years ago with just an update, a guidance document to K97-1, but then they canceled that, and they subsequently came out with two guidance documents, one for the hardware or the device itself, and the second for any firmware or software in the device. And the majority of the information on both the guidance documents are very similar, and also very similar to the old K97-1 memo. In terms of questions and decision tree, however, the new ones do separate where software is an issue or firmware is an issue, add some additional points of consideration, and especially in the appendices where there's specific questions or examples given. So the assumption is made that if you're seriously doing these things or considering these things because you have products that fall into this purview, that you, in addition to consider the material we'll be discussing here in this presentation, that you download copies from the FDA's website, fda.gov, of those two guidance documents. Or if it's just device hardware or the device itself and no software, just the one on the device, not the one with the software. But so there's no attempt here to go line by line to the guidance document. We'll talk about the overall strategic way to address these issues and some specific points you want to take away that you would need when you're referring to those two guidance documents. So the guidance documents, they've been out for a couple of years now, deal with deciding when to submit a 510K for a change to an existing device. Now all these assume the fact that you've already got a 510K for your product. And now you're making changes to your product. You had clearance for it the way it was originally built, designed and built, but now you're making changes to it. And you want to evaluate whether the one change or a series of changes reaches a point where you have to file a new 510K against your previous 510K. And that's to an existing device. And the second guidance document is deciding when to submit a 510K for software changes to an existing device. And they're dated November 16, 2017. And they replaced the memo as well as the draft guidance document that came out earlier. So some of the key points to take away from this, because even using the guidance documents, you may get into heartburn areas, gray areas. The guidance document does not immediately solve the questions. It helps you to better understand the FDA's reasoning on things, but there's still a tendency to sweat it. And this presentation hopefully will focus on the key areas that you will need to focus on to determine whether you need to file a new 510K. So in looking at the introductions to these guidance documents, we're looking at basically principles from all three of them, the K97-1 as well as the two guidance documents. We're not really considering too much about the one that was the draft guidance that was pulled, although it's reflected in part by being split up into the two new guidance documents that have been made final guidance documents. I put in red some of the key points to consider and evaluate when you're going through your consideration of whether to file a new 510K. First of all, it has to be a significant change, creating a significant effect upon the results that were cleared by the FDA. Remember, the 510K you submitted had to show, and we'll discuss the 510K principles a little later on, had to show that your device was substantially equivalent to what's already on the marketplace. And so it was evaluated from that standpoint based on the data you submitted. Now, if you've made some changes that significantly impact the data submitted that was evaluated by the FDA in granting you the original clearance, that would be a strong indicator that you may need to file a new 510K. But that's a basic principle. We want to look at ways in which we can apply that as we go through this presentation. Now, you notice significant changes, significant modifications. The word significant is repeated over and over again, and significantly affects safety and effectiveness. Now, this means you have to do a 510, an analysis of the risk of your product against patient use and clinical use. So this would be the ISO 14971 document. And the FDA does not specify which version. They accept the 2007 version. A lot of my clients, that's the one they still use. If you're dealing with CE marking overseas, you're looking at 2012 and or a subsequent replacement that's being evaluated. So if you're dealing with primarily the US FDA, you can certainly use the 14971 2007 version, which says you reduce risk as low as practical. The 2012 talks about reducing risk as low as possible. A big difference in the meaning between those two. But the key word is significant changes and significant effect on safety and or effectiveness. Either one of those are issues that could trigger a new 510K. And you're expected to do this analysis in a systematic way. The guidance documents provide questions and flow charts to allow you to make that type of decision, but it's still going to leave you with some questions, as I mentioned earlier. Even if you follow the questions and the flow charts religiously, you're still going to have to make, in some cases, a call as to whether this really applies. And one of the areas, now the guidance documents specifically say if your test data clearly shows no problem, that automatically says you don't need a 510K. And I tend to favor that approach, but recognize the FDA says that that's not the case. If you affect safety and effectiveness, and even if you can show a major effective means of validating it in-house, so there's no issue in the field, you have to seriously consider whether that in itself is sufficient reason not to file a 510K. But it can give you a strong argument that you do not have to. So bear that in mind as you go through the flow charts and the questions that are in the document. I'm not going to repeat them in this presentation, but certainly if you're considering this, you want to have those guidance documents in front of you, and you want to use those flow charts. Certainly, guidance documents come out and state from the FDA standpoint, these are not law, they're not binding, but in reality, they're pretty close to binding, or you have to have a viable alternative that's as good as, if not better than those guidance documents, which is a lot easier just to follow the guidance document. Now you notice here a significant change in design, material, chemical composition, energy source, or manufacturing process. I'll give you an example of a change, energy source. Now you might think if you go from 110 volts to a battery 9-volt source, that eliminates all risk. Wrong. From the FDA standpoint, it could increase risk. And in most cases, such a change would require a new 510K. And here's why. The risk of a shock is greatly, eliminated, basically, if you go to 9 volt from 110 volt. But the 9 volt source make some changes to your alarm system that can create serious risk of serious injury or death. So the key defining factor is, does this change, could it cause significant injury or serious injury and or death? And that's one of your key determinants regarding the safety part. The effectiveness part you have to evaluate as well based on your requirements. And so another area which is automatically a trigger for a new 510K is a major change or modification in the intended use of the device and or its use population, etc., indications for use. If you change those, more than likely you're going to have to file a new 510K. If you find a safety problem in the field that resulted in a safety alert and or a recall, and you make changes to eliminate that problem, more than likely that will drive a 510K, irrespective of all these other considerations we're talking about. So those are some key areas that are red flags to you and or a reviewer that a new 510K more than likely will be required. The key issue, and this is stated by the FDA in their 21 CFR, which is the law, the phrase could significantly affect the safety and effectiveness. So that isn't cut and dried. When you look at that, you have to really evaluate what does this mean in terms of my product and my intended use in the field. So you notice it brings out here manufacturers and the FDA sometimes come to different interpretations. But the FDA expects you to do an honest evaluation, supporting it hopefully with a risk management document, including a hazard analysis and various risk management tools such as FEMA's, FEMECA's, fault tree analysis, etc. And then come up with values that indicate it was minor or major. So before you do this activity, make sure you have such a risk document in your file. You should anyway, as part of your design control process for devices and combination products. Now, this is an interesting point. This brings out that you have to consider, too, the role of your quality system, quality management system. In other words, if you're rigorously following the CGMPs for your device, including verification, validation, design controls, change control, etc., the tighter that control and the better the results that that control provides in terms of safety and effectiveness as to any changes you make, the little more solid ground you're on when you don't file a 510K, with the exception of some of those mandatory areas I mentioned earlier. So this is an important point to keep in mind. You shouldn't have a flaky GMP system, but if you have a solid GMP system which has tight control over changes and tight mandates regarding the verification, validation, and or monitoring of such changes, you can feel a little more comfortable if you get into gray areas where you decide, should I or should I not file a 510K? So whether you file or not, you still are responsible to manage your changes and verify and validate those changes and monitor those changes to make sure they have no deleterious effect on the product and or the use of the product in the field by the patient and or the clinician. Now, when we talk about risk management, risk-based activities, we are talking about the definition in ISO 14971, which means risk to the patient, the end user, the clinician, the hospital tech, et cetera, who is using that product. It is not talking about financial risk to your company, scheduling risk, budget risk, et cetera. I've seen companies get into trouble with this, primarily overseas, where the definition of risk is also under ISO 31000, which talks about these other risks as well, and the companies place a lot of emphasis on those risks as opposed to the patient risk. When the FDA talks about risk, they're concerned with the end user, the patient, period. The other risks are business concern, yes. But when we talk about risk in this discussion, and when the FDA talks about it regarding medical products, they're talking about patient risk. So you have to look at all issues and look at them as follow them through your system all the way to the end user and determine whether this particular change has some kind of negative effect on my end user and what severity is that effect upon that end user, primarily the patient but also the clinician. That's an important distinction to keep in mind because, as I mentioned before, I've seen that consideration violated quite a bit in the field. And so is the FDA. It's almost a guaranteed warning letter. Notice this point, any process whose results cannot be fully verified by subsequent inspection and testing must be validated. Now, I've seen the FDA really get tight on that principle to the point where even where you can fully verify a process, they sometimes require post-process validation of some kind of check and balance or pre-production and process control system in place. So wherever there is a question, go ahead and do that additional validation downstream where you feel you've addressed it upstream. Especially that's true if you're dealing sample inspections with humans, as opposed to automated, using validated equipment, automated 100% inspection with equipment. So where you make a change, and the FDA doesn't discourage changes. They want to see progress in your devices. They want to see improvement in the quality and the safety of that device and the effectiveness. So don't view this as a indication that the FDA doesn't want to do change. Now, sad to say, when it's implemented in the field, when people inspect things in the field, sometimes they bring certain proclivities of their own to the issue. Sometimes that happens internally with your QC department, but frequently it will happen with your FDA inspector, a consumer safety officer. And so you need to bear that in mind and make sure you carefully document your considerations and don't just make assumptions that it's obvious or readily apparent. Document all the rationale and the assumptions and do it in some degree of detail so that you can mitigate or reduce the chance of being second-guessed. According to the FDA, you as the manufacturer have the best understanding of your product and its use in the field. But that won't stop your inspector from second-guessing you. So try to minimize the second-guessing by your documentation, your thoroughness of the documentation, and the obvious intent to be a good corporate citizen and address safety and effectiveness concerns in a fair and impartial manner. The moment the FDA feels you're being self-serving, the tighter they're going to get on their inspection, and the more likely you're going to have a negative outcome. So a lot of that plays into this because you're dealing with human nature, and as we mentioned earlier, some of these things are highly subjective, or at least somewhat subjective, and the guidance documents do not fully eliminate that subjectivity. So your detail, your thoroughness of documentation and testing and challenging should help alleviate the interpretation of subjectivity on the part of someone else reviewing your system and decisions. Obviously, you're required to keep records, and they must be available to an FDA inspector. That includes whether it be a manual record, paper record, and or electronic record. With electronic records, it must be readily retrievable. I'll have an audit trail and date type stamping, that's Part 11 requirement, and be able to be a copy provided to the inspector, such as a paper copy, a printout. Now you notice this, and I put it in red. For many changes to a device, a submission of a new 510K may not be required. In these cases, including for many design changes, compliance with the quality system regulation, that's the 820 CGMPs, can reasonably assure the safety and effectiveness of the changed device. If you're dealing with a combination device that's under 21 CFR 4, it basically defaults to the driving CGMPs. The driving CGMPs are the drug CGMPs, 210 to 11. You still have to meet design control under 820.30 if it's a device drug combination product. So at this point, it basically applies for all types of device coming under the 510K, this consideration. But make sure you well document anything where you decide you do not need to file a 510K, unless it's a really simple change where you can, your explanation is, it's almost readily apparent. Don't assume that though. But the more it gets into these subjective areas, the gray areas, quote unquote, where your call could go either way, make sure you have good test data to support your decision. Make sure you have good risk analysis and tie into the risk analysis to your decision-making process literally in your documentation, and make sure your documentation is thorough, fully supports your decision. That doesn't mean you won't be challenged on it, and you may lose that challenge, but at least it would show you did your due diligence, came to an honest decision, whether the FDA fully agrees with it or not. So we're going to spend a little time talking about change, because that's the crucial aspect of this entire aspect. If you're evaluating your device whenever you make a change to it, you have to evaluate it from two standpoints. One, the severity of the one change, the latest change itself. Does this change raise new issues of safety and effectiveness that weren't addressed in the FDA's review of the original 510K? If it does, more than likely you need to file a new 510K. But the second aspect you have to evaluate with every change is, does this new change plus all the previous changes from the last 510K you as a company submitted, does that cumulative set of changes drive the need for a new 510K? Does it raise new questions of safety and efficacy? So you have to be able to track all your changes, and whenever you look at a change, you have to be able to look at the most recent change and then pull up by whatever means possible, paper or electronic, the series of changes that went before on that device and look at them collectively as well as the individual last change. And then make your decisions based on both of those areas. The last change, is it severe enough, and or the cumulative set of changes, are they collectively severe enough to drive the need for a new 510K? So it's important that you document each change that is made. You recognize what a change is in the company. Your system recognizes it, it documents it, and it also allows you to pull up all the previous changes and evaluate all of them together and record your decisions regarding that. So some of the areas where a change may be generated is change requests and obviously in change orders. Bench testing may reveal some problems. Maybe the need for re-verification and revalidation, or if you add some features to your device, you will do a new validation and or verification. Depending on the nature of that new change itself and or the results from the verification validation, that may tell you that you need to file a new 510K. Same goes for functional testing, biological testing, if biocompatibility is an issue, sterilization testing, if sterilization is a need for your product, is sterile, investigational device exemptions and IRB, institutional review boards and clinical trials for your product. Maybe, well, if you're looking for a new use or intended use, you automatically have to file anyway. But if for some reason it may have done some more of this, it may point out some other problems requiring changes. More than likely, those kind of changes will drive a 510K. So make sure your system, look at your entire system, make sure it captures these types of changes for analysis. That's the key point of some of these slides we'll be talking about here. Changes in intended use and indications for use, automatic 510K. Labeling, if it's used to just clarify things or correct mistakes in the previous labeling, that's not an issue. You just document that under your change control system. But if it affects intended use or some safety features, adds other warnings or cautions, more than likely that will require a new 510K. You're listing with the FDA. If some changes occur to that fall into these other categories, that will trigger one. A recall for safety reasons, that's generally what they are, will almost automatically, with the changes necessary to resolve the issue that drove the recall, which could be a production method as well as a device method, may require a new 510. Almost always would require a 510K. It's certainly a red flag. Change in intended use, we mentioned that earlier. Oh, excuse me. So when you're looking at your entire system, you need to look at, does my system capture and record changes? Now with software, that could be an issue because some of your programmers, if they're not highly disciplined in a medical products field under the FDA, they may tend to view a minor code change as just that and not report it or record it. I've seen this happen in companies, so I know it does happen. It's not just blue sky thinking on the part of a consultant. Very important that you make sure your programmers view their requirements not just from an artist standpoint, but from the standpoint they are under a regulatory responsibility. in terms of their changes. So no matter how quote unquote simple those software changes may be, whether they be to code, algorithm, whatever. Does your system drive the review of each change and the cumulative changes we mentioned earlier? And how do you document each? So the most common, traditional, we're going to talk about the 510K because looking at a 510K will give you an idea of where to look at capturing changes, for example. And then you're going to have to file a new one anyway. Now, if you're dealing with a product that you've got a 510K for, and that's the purpose of our discussion here, you've got the original device against that 510K. Now you make changes to it, and at some point in time you determine you need to file a new 510K. More than likely, you can file a special if you're changing a past 510K you own. So in many cases, though, you may want to consider the traditional anyway, which is the one we'll talk about in the next few slides, because what I have experienced when I filed special 510Ks is that the reviewer ends up requesting enough information where I could have just go ahead and submitted the traditional anyway, because by the time I supplied all the requested additional information, I had what amounted to a traditional 510K submission. The abbreviated would not apply here, citing of special guidance documents and standards that we apply. And of course, one of your copies has to be an e-copy. So when you're dealing with a 510K resubmitting, the guidance documents use the term original device rather than predicate device, but that's what it is. Your original device is the predicate device, because they do talk about substantial equivalence in the guidance documents that we're talking about here. So bear in mind that when you see the term original device, they're talking about your predicate device, your previous cleared 510K, your last previous cleared 510K. And that's where you start looking at all the changes since that device was cleared by the FDA. To determine whether their clearance was sufficient to address all the safety and effectiveness issues you are raising since then with your changes. If you feel you reach a point where you exceed the level of review they gave you at the previous submission, that's a good indication that you need to file a new 510K. So if you can prove substantial equivalence to the predicate or the original device with no real safety and or effectiveness concerns that are new issues, you more than likely will not have to file a new 510K. This deals with issues like material sterilization generally will require a new 510K. Intended use will require a 510K. Serious safety and effectiveness changes will require a new 510K, significant. So, but again, what does the word significant mean? Much of it is tied to significant risk to the patient. So what are the elements when you're looking at possible changes requiring a new 510K? Well, you don't care about the medical device user fee. You don't care about the pre-markets cover sheet. The cover letter would be an overall document you want to look at to see what was the issues when you originally filed. The indications for use statement is a key document you want to look at to see if that's changed. Your summary or your statement, and in most cases it would be a summary document, which summarizes the entire 510K. That would be a document you want to look at too to see if your change is significant. Truthful and accuracy is not a consideration for considering filing a new one. Class 3 summary and certification would not be an issue document you care to refer to. Financial certification, not. Declaration of conformity and summary report, yes, it would. An executive summary, definitely. And device description. These would all be sections in your old 510K you'd want to review to see if anything of the major has significantly changed, raising new issues of safety and efficacy. The substantial equivalence discussion would certainly be a key document looked at. Your labeling, as we mentioned earlier, if you're making changes to correct mistakes or just cosmetic changes, you have to record those changes in-house, but they are not require a new 510K. Labeling that affects safety issues, efficacy issues, and or intended use issues would require a new 510K. So you may be gotten used to over years several changes to your labeling. Well, it's important to go back to what you originally submitted to the FDA and look at that as your determining factor. And that's why we're going back to the original 510K here to see what changed. Hopefully you have evaluated all the lists of changes by looking at your change history. But it's good to compare your current product and the proposed product with the latest change against the submission that you made that has been cleared by the FDA to see if there's differences that aren't as obvious in the link of change, the history of changes, but you can look at the stark contrast between then and now. And that's why we're stressing some of these points. The guidance documents just allude to this, but this is certainly a key factor in determining whether the changes were significant. Biocompatibility issues, software, we're talking about that in general here. EMC and safety, electrical safety, as I mentioned earlier with the example with the battery versus the line voltage. Performance test data, if that raises a red flag. If you have some animal testing and clinical testing subsequent to this that raises questions, that too will be a consideration as well. Others usually more appendices type information. We're not going to spend a lot of time on these areas. Just one point of reference too, if you're dealing with selling your product all over the world, the U.S. has its classification based on law. That's 21 CFR 800 series. And that'll tell you whether your device is class 1, class 2, or if it's not listed there, it'd be class 3 or possibly de novo. If you're dealing with the European Union, you're dealing with the old Medical Device Directive, and as of late April this year, it'll be fully replaced by the Medical Device Regulation, and it has Annex 9 in either one of those, and various rules. And you and your notified body go through those and determine which classification based on those rules. So FDA classification is defined by law. In the European Union and countries abide by that same model, it's determined by you, the manufacturer, and your notified body, primarily the notified body, based on rules in the Medical Device Regulation / Directive. The panel that comes from the Code of Federal Regulation, the 800 series, it tells you which panel it's. The product code, that's usually 3 alpha characters, have no bearing on anything else. One FDA person told me they were initials of the original reviewers, and that makes about as much sense as any other explanation I've heard. They're purely random. But the regulation, the 3 numerics, the dot, and then the 4 numerics specifically identify products, and that's what you also want to have, the regulation itself to determine classification. Now for the software, I use this software guidance for submission of 510Ks of devices containing software as not just a guidance, but a rule. If you're going to submit a device to the FDA initially or with a change, you're going to have to follow this guidance document. You're going to have to include these 11 documents or have them available, depending on the risk. Some are submitted, some are not, but they all have to exist. And I use this as a model for all software firmware validation documentation. You have to perform risk analysis, which results in minimum, moderate, or major. Moderate is the default for a class 2 510K at least. moderate, or major risk. And that presupposes that you've done a risk analysis, and I recommend using the ISO 14971 anyway at this point. It doesn't call out in the software guidance, but it does specifically in our 2 guidance documents for changes. They reference ISO 14971. So you have to do that. And as I mentioned earlier, as far as the FDA is concerned, it can be the 2007 version. So you perform your risk analysis, you come up with the level of concern. This is from table 3 of the guidance document we're referring here. Then you have a software description. This is a high-level description of what the software is supposed to do, 30,000-foot view, so to speak. Then the specific breakout of that into a software requirements specification, or a list of requirements that software is to accomplish in your use of that software, or in the device we're talking about here. If it's custom software, you'll have a design spec for the software, which explodes the software requirements specification into the engineering spell out of how you meet those requirements. Architecture is a block diagram. Development history, this deals with custom software as well, standards that applied, etc. The actual test cases under the V&V. The traceability, generally tracing the test cases to the requirements. I've seen arguments on the internet saying the traceability should address all the above. I only do that with high risk, and I've never had a pushback from the FDA on that. But you certainly want to make sure all your requirements have been addressed by test cases under your V&V. T stands for testing, to be synonymous with verification. Traceability is usually by a matrix. Then you have unresolved anomalies. These are lists of bugs that you leave in your software or have been left in the software because they're known and they don't cause any problems for your use of that software. And by trying to eliminate those bugs, you may introduce other bugs that are unknown that can cause serious problems. So the FDA allows you to identify benign bugs. You may have to record that in your labeling as well. And the various revisions numbers leading to your release number to the field. So this is the kind of documentation you'd have to have. And if you're making changes to your software, you'd certainly want to look at your description, your requirements, if it's custom, your design spec, your architecture, and the test data to determine whether or not you have to file a new one, whether they raise new issues of safety and efficacy. The interesting thing that the guidance documents bring out, the software guidance document brings out on changes, is with software, when you're dealing with risk, the probability of occurrence is not an issue, because if it exists, it's going to occur. There's no probability involved. So the FDA says you focus on severity. So your probability would be 100% basically with software if something happens. If you're doing risk priority numbers, like severity, probability, and effectiveness of control type of consideration in your FEMAs and FMECAs. Incidentally, certain consultants on the internet say that a FEMA or FMECA is not the best choice for risk analysis, although 14971 specifically mentions those as a good tool. What I've done, and I've done this for years, is I include not only failure modes on the left-hand column, but normal use problems, like anaphylactic shock, allergy reactions, and things like that. So that addresses the concern that some consultants have stated that FEMA or FMECA is not an effective tool for medical product risk analysis. I would disagree. I've gone through numerous regulatory inspections, which in some cases were adversarial because of the attitude the company originally had toward the FDA, and made no bones about it. And also in submissions to the FDA on 510Ks and ITEs, and I've never had an issue raised using that document, because I do many times submit it as part of the submission of the 510K. And in one case, we actually had several FDA inspectors on site for many months going through these documents as we generated them. And they had no problem with using failure bone effect analysis as part of the risk analysis tools. So just a point of consideration. Biocompatibility issues, of course, that could be a major trigger for a new 510K. Now, of course, when you're submitting a new 510K, you stress similarities, as you well know. You want to show any changes you make are well addressed. But when you're submitting this new one, obviously the changes were significant. So even though you can show similarities, you still have to show how you reduce the fact that a significant risk has been imposed here, how you reduce that to the actual low risk translated to the patient, low or non-existent risk to the patient. Now, both the old Blue Book memorandum, the K97-1, and the proposed draft, which was canceled, and the two new guidance documents, which we're talking about here today for devices and software, all contain decision trees and narratives and flow charts. So they have a narrative and question and answer type sequence, and they have some suggestions and examples, and also flow charts to allow you to make a decision. And you can certainly use those flow charts and narratives, copy them and annotate them if you choose to do so by means of a computer program or manual if you want, or develop matrices from that to allow you to show the steps you went through in each change analysis you make. To document what I'll show later on as a way to include proof of that in your ultimate documentation. Once again, we reiterate this. You're responsible to evaluate the last change you're making in terms of whether it affects safety and effectiveness, and or all the subsequent changes plus the last change since your last filing of the 510K as to whether that cumulative effect affects your significant impact on the end user. So each change must be assessed individually and collectively, and you must document that to determine whether a new 510K is required. Now, the guidance documents, starting with the Blue Book memorandum on down, say a manufacturer makes this decision. In contrast to European Union, where changes are evaluated by you and your notified body, and you have to publish new technical documentation and run them through the various countries you're selling your product, CE mark product in. With the U.S., you make that decision. You decide whether you're going to file a 510K or not. You document that decision, and then you just wait. Now, the guidance documents say that if you made a bunch of changes and none of those triggered the need to file a new 510K, then you go ahead and implement those changes and put the product in the marketplace. If you do a bunch of changes and none of them individually would trigger it, but all of them collectively would, you can implement those that didn't trigger the need for a 510K without getting a new 510K, and then list the last one that triggered the need cumulatively considered as the need for the 510K, but list all the previous changes as well. Anytime you file a new 510K, you have to list all changes since the last 510K, as well as of course, you're focusing on the one that triggered the need for a new 510K. So, but you make that decision, and the FDA, if you made the decision not to file, they won't know whether you made a right one or a wrong one until they come in to inspect your facility and look at your documentation. And then they may challenge you or not. But if you decide to file, then you can't implement the change that triggered that decision to file until you get a clearance. But other previous changes you can implement if you haven't at that point in time. Now, one of the working group's recommendations back on the 510K process years ago It was 2010, August 2010, with the recommendations published in January 2011, recommended that companies provide regular updates annually to their products to the FDA. That's never been implemented. So to this day, sometimes 510Ks are owned by companies that didn't originally file them, and yet still show the original filer as the one submitting that 510K. So looking at a 510K, you can always determine who's got the 510K currently manufacturing product under it. And the same goes for the degrees of change, etc. So as we mentioned again, if you're going to, this whole system is based on your ability to capture changes and evaluate each change individually and all changes collectively. If you have a loose system here, your GMP system is not the best, you've got some major problems. And you need to tighten that before you try to implement what we've been discussing here. The issues that are the key issues for consideration for your device and changes as to whether or not they trigger a need is changes in the control mechanism, changes in the operating principles, changing in the energy type. These are red flags that need to be carefully evaluated, and you want to document those. Environmental and performance specification changes require an analysis. Ergonomics, human factors, use engineering changes. Dimensional specs may or may not. In many cases it does not, but it depends on where they are and the risk involved in any of these. Software or firmware changes, that's a red flag. You need to carefully evaluate whether that, it might be just a routine maintenance issue. But you have to be careful what you're labeling routine maintenance issue as well. If any of these changes affect indications for use, that's a mandatory required 510K submission. Clinical data needed to establish safety and efficacy is a major indication of the need for filing a new 510K. If your design validations suddenly show problems that require a change in your method of validation, that more than likely will require a new 510K. Strongly, would be a strong indicator. Packaging or expiration dating may or may not. Do the results in the design validation raise new issues of safety and efficacy? Sterilization more than likely will require a new 510K. Change in sterilization, not in the existing ethylene oxide or gamma, but if you're going from one to the other, it more than likely will. So you need to consider too, if any of these changes drive a change in performance specs, that may require a 510K. Is there a decrease in the sterility assurance level? More than likely that will require a 510K. Not an increase, but a decrease in that SAL. Material type and formulation may or may not. If it's an implant, does it affect, does it contact body tissue, fluids, etc., and have an effect on that? More than likely it would there. Change in material supplier may or may not. Change in performance specs. Now you've seen some history with DuPont with their changing of Tyvek for the sterile barrier. They've coordinated their change with the FDA. They worked with them over many, many years. They've provided webinars on the subject, articles on the subject, a lot of information to their users to let them know what's coming down the pike, because this is a major change. But whether or not it'll require a new 510K, the indications seem to be not, but it would be up to you as a company to evaluate that and include key parts of that documentation provided by DuPont to make that final determination. Change in performance specs, as we mentioned earlier. Biocompatibility issue. Now this is referring back to some of the changes in your sterilization procedure as well that could affect those. If you require new clinical data to establish safety and efficacy, then more than likely that will be a 510K. But if you're showing conformance to a recognized standard by such data, a 510K is not required. We mentioned that, and the design validations that raise new issues of safety and efficacy would require it. Because now you've raised issues that weren't considered in your original 510K submission. Now, device guidance refers to non-software changes. If you're dealing with a product that has software and you're making changes to both software and hardware, you'll have to consider both guidance documents. But the principles underlying both those guidance documents are the same, and they're pretty much what we're covering here. Notice here, multiple changes affect labeling or hardware in addition to software. Manufacturer assesses the changes using both software and the general device guidance documents. And if either guidance leads to new 510K conclusion, submission is likely required. Now that's a quote from them. So you say if the guidance leads to a conclusion for a new 510K, then more than likely it is required. That seems to indicate that there could be some exceptions with very extremely good data and no high risk involved, that even though the flow charts and the questions might seem to indicate a new 510K is required, your data overwhelmingly shows that that's not required. You ultimately have to make that decision. The FDA has a right to second guess you when they come in to do an inspection. As we mentioned earlier, combination products. The combination product is driven by the key high-risk component. So in a drug-device combination, often it's the drug. So these guidance documents are not going to help you a lot there. But when you're dealing with 21 CFR 4, as I mentioned, basically it combines 820 and 210, 211 for a drug-device combination product. And if its drug is the high-risk component, which describes the operating CGMP system, which would be the drug CGMP system, you still have to consider design controls, 820.30, as part of that operating system. And then now you're still looking at issues that may require you to file a new 510K, even though it's a combination product where drugs are the key issue. Now, remanufacture or reprocess single-use devices. We're not talking about devices that are designed to be reused. We're talking about devices that are designed to be thrown away after one use and are reprocessed by, say, hospitals or third-party reprocessors. If you as a company have the 510K and for the reprocessing and you're making changes to your reprocessing methodology, then you have to file a new 510K if it raises the issue of safety and efficacy, and frequently it will. So you're dealing with contamination issues and sterility issues. If you are the OEM manufacturer of a single-use device and somebody else has got about a 510K to take your device and similar type of devices and clean and disinfect and sterilize and refurbish them and send them back to a user under contract, they have their own 510K. And you are not required to file a new 510K based on refurbishing or reprocessing, but they are if they make changes to that. As long as your product in the initial use is not raising these new issues, but their subsequent use is. This is a very common practice. Product verification and validation, as we mentioned earlier, if you have results that change in this, or your verification validation activities raise questions of safety and efficacy of significant value, then you have to file a new 510K. Now, I define verification as testing and checking and inspecting, and validation is a sum total of a bunch of checks and tests, etc., that cumulatively have to be met for the product to be considered validatable or validated. There's a chart that the FDA published under Kim Troutman's presentations in the mid-1990s under design control, how they define validation. There's a series of verifications. Now, some companies have a verification pathway and a validation pathway as separate. Nothing wrong with that. I view it as you have to do all these interim verifications in order to prove that the ultimate user needs have been met by the medical device, such as biocompatibility, sterility, shake and drop testing, functional testing, etc. Those things all have to be separately tested in order to say you validated your product. That's why I come up with the definition I did. But if there's changes indicated, if you do a revalidation and you suddenly see something come up that never came up before, maybe you tighten your validation, maybe just by the sample sizes, some samples came out this time that didn't come out last time and were non-conforming, may raise questions that ultimately make you decide to file a new 510K. I tend to say that if you have strong verification validation systems in place and your data is rock solid, that can do a lot toward reducing the need to file a new 510K. The guidance documents specifically say that is not reason of itself to do so, but you have to determine whether you can prove that there's no new significant issues raised by the changes because of your verification validation activities, either the ones for design control or the ones that are part of your normal manufacturing process. And you can't use that as a cop-out or an escape phrase. You have to sincerely show that your systems are rock solid, they were very vigorous, they used worst-case allowables in their consideration, they weren't shortchanged, and as a result of that robust validation, you don't see any issues here, certainly no significant issues of safety and effectiveness affecting significant safety and effectiveness personal issues. Then you can be a little more comfortable in making the determination that your validations have helped you establish that those issues don't exist and you don't need to file. But you are the ones responsible to make that decision, and you will have to stand by that decision if you're challenged on the part of an inspector. Now, if your performance is within the criteria established by the original 510K, that pretty much obviates the need for a new 510K. Notice here, verification validation, the third point number 4 here, do not reveal new risks or significant modified existing risks apart from performance. So if the risks maybe even enhance the performance a little, but you haven't raised new issues regarding its usage and or haven't showed any significant risk because of this, more than likely you will not have to file. So use the flow charts, use the questions, look at your data, and bottom line is, are there issues raised here with this change or the series of changes affecting significant issues of safety and effectiveness, especially dealing with significant risk to patient health? Those are the key areas you want to look at. They're reiterating the guidance documents, and I'm reiterating here in this presentation. Now, if all these criteria are met down the bottom here, then the change is unlikely to significantly affect safety and effectiveness, and manufacturers should proceed with the change, making sure to document their assessment. That's a key point, whether submission of a new 510K is required. You want to carefully document that. And bear in mind that when you do a documentation, it's usually fresh in your mind and fresh in your team's mind. But after a few months, it won't be. So make sure your documentation goes overboard in specifying all the considerations arrived at, and maybe revisit it a few months later to see if it still does. I've seen many times during an FDA inspection where an inspector took a document to the person that signed off on it, or the persons that signed off on it, and asked them to explain it, and they couldn't do it. That's extremely embarrassing. But that indicates to me that the information recorded may have been obvious at the time it was recorded because everything was in their fresh in people's minds and they could easily understand what was put down on the document. But months later, it wasn't fresh in mind, and there was too much assumed in the documentation that wasn't recorded right in the documentation. Too much between the lines type stuff. So make sure you capture all of it and then some. That's a little easier than having the embarrassment later on that your documentation really does not support the decision when it's looked just at itself as a standalone. So how do you document the change versus the 510K review? Remember, every time there's a change, you have to do this review, both at looking just at the change and then looking at the cumulative effect of all the changes. So your system must be able to pull up, well, obviously you have the original change or the current change because that's probably the document you're looking at, the change order. But you also have to be able to pull up all the subsequent previous changes since the last 510K. That's why I mentioned going back to your original 510K and looking at your current change document and comparing the two and seeing what's substantially changed and making sure you've captured all that and evaluated all of it, each change as it went through the cycle and then the subsequent all changes. The last change may not of itself been enough to trigger a need for 510K, but when you consider it and all the others collectively, the cumulative effect might be such. That example I mentioned earlier, that you could manufacture or include in your new product all the changes that didn't drive the need for a 510K in your product, but you can't include the one that triggers the need for new 510K, whether singly or cumulatively, until you've gotten a new 510K clearance. So basically, makes it a little more difficult when all the changes individually weren't significant, but cumulative, all those changes were significant. We'll touch here, so make sure your documentation addresses that. So this is just one way you could do it. On your change order, you have, does this change affect the existing 510K by raising new safety and or efficacy issues? Yes or no, circle it, and you could explain. I say if yes, explain, but you could say if no, explain, or just explain, either way. Include your rationale here, or see attachment if it's using a more extensive rationale, maybe even citing validation test report numbers, etc. And then the second question, does this change in all previous changes since the last 510K raise new safety and efficacy issues? Yes or no, and I might say just explain, period. And then if yes to either above, then a new 510K will have to be initiated. So really, you might even want to change the yes to no, because if yes, it's obvious you're going to have to do a 510K, and it will explain it all in 510K. You cite the new 510K number. But if it's no, you'll have to spend a little more time explaining why you reached that decision. So the explanation should be just for everything. I've done it. It depends on what you as a company decide to do. Here's a more detailed way to do that. Remember I mentioned earlier you could take the guidance documents and annotate the flow chart and or the questions. That's one way. It's even alluded to in the guidance document that's a way approach you could take. Or you could take each one of those and list the categories and indicate them. In which case I like to list every single one, even those that don't apply, to make sure that you can see you didn't accidentally leave something off. You considered everything, and those that did apply, you indicate a rationale. Those that don't apply, you just NA, not applicable. This is perhaps the most formal way, and for most changes, this would be the most beneficial way. But for a lot of really minor changes, you can use that checklist. That's what I would recommend. And if you're using the checklist and you have to go through this route, I just say see attached document or see the change analysis document, number thus and so. If you're dealing with sterilization changes, you may be able to do an analysis, your Tier 28 analysis, AAMI Tier 28 analysis. Get the document itself, the AAMI Tier 28 document, and go through it. Develop a matrix to show that you evaluated your new product or the change product and or its packaging against the previous product and that was validated under the process. In this case, we're talking about ethylene oxide sterilization, uses similar premise for gamma, but primarily for ethylene oxide as a Tier 28 analysis. This can show that you can grandfather your new your changed product packaging based on a worst case previous validated product packaging. So in most cases, when you do an original validation or revalidation of your sterilization process, you should be dealing with your worst case products, your killer products, so to speak. Longest tubing, smallest ID diameter tubing, etc., etc. So these are things you need to consider, explain, and then anything else comes in. If you can show that it's not as hard to sterilize as your control document, control product, you can do this type of analysis as well. And this will preclude the need to file a new 510K in many cases. The FDA hasn't stated that, but this gives you a really structured approach to show that your product has been already validated, it has all been cleared by the FDA. Theoretically, hopefully the product validated as the original 510K product, and it's worst case, and the changes are subsequently less severe. What I have here is an example of procedure trays with a lot of different products involved in your conclusions. So what are the key principles we want to take away from this? We need to recognize that the changes are made that significantly affect safety and effectiveness of the device will have to be carefully looked at, and more than likely will require a 510K. You have to do a risk-based assessment based on ISO 14971 to look at both safety and effectiveness. But your risk analysis will mainly focus on the safety part of it. Your test data will, functional test data, etc., will look at the effectiveness, although there can be some overlap. Unintended consequences of changes. This is an important issue because, first of all, when I talk to people, especially engineers, they talk about sometimes this is a no-brainer change. Well, there's no such thing as a no-brainer change. I've seen some discussion on the internet just in the last few weeks about like-for-like validations. I don't believe there are such things as like-for-like validations. Everything has a slight variation to it from something else that's supposedly identical, and you have to address that. So make sure when you do changes, you consider unintended consequences. Now, that's easier said than done. And your risk document should help you to do that, but if they're unintended, they may not even be on the risk document. You have to add them later on with an update to your risk document, which should be a control document. Use of risk management tools, and that should be incorporated into your ISO 14971 risk management file and report. Testing and verification validation. The FDA guidance document says that does not preclude the need for a new 510K, but to me, the stronger that data is, the more it raises the threshold of what is a significant threat in the way of a change. You make that ultimate decision, though. You have to determine one change, and you have to determine all changes each time you look at a change. You have to look at comparative devices as well. Documentation required. Heavily document these decisions. Reference the appropriate associated documents, if you will. And substantial equivalence or equivalence to your original device as opposed to predicate device is the terminology used in the guidance document. So does the change significantly affect patient safety, user safety, budget safety, financial risk, all that kind of stuff? I think we understand it. When we say risk-based, that's what we're talking about. Do the changes significantly affect efficacy? So ease of use, purpose of use, indications for use. What does the new V&V, verification and validation data, prove? Does it raise any questions there? Is it solid? Are there issues raised in this, and then why is it a new verification validation test case as opposed to the old one repeated? Does it affect the data, or does it raise new issues since the data that was submitted to the original 510K was evaluated by the FDA? What is the degree of patient and user risk remaining after the change? And document your decisions. Now, we mentioned in the very beginning the wrong decision. Remember, the manufacturer makes this decision. So you make that decision. It is subjective to some degree, even with the flow charts and the questions. And so it's up to you to have a good defense as to why you made the decision you did make. But recognize that the FDA inspector is going to challenge that. They may challenge it just on principle. They may feel, hey, this is a red flag area. I feel, as an inspector, the manufacturer decide not to file. I'm just going to challenge them to see their rationale. It's not readily fully evident in this documentation, so they may do that. And you may either acquiesce or you may say, no, we feel the data is sufficient. I have actually done this in one case. We took it to the local office. They upheld the inspector. We appealed to the district office. They upheld the inspector. And we felt so strongly about it. We had clinicians' data on file to support our position. We filed with the center and asked for a decision. And the center upheld us as the company as opposed to the resident post and the district office. So if you have strong data and you feel strongly about it, go with that and make sure your documentation is supportive. And then when you're challenged by the inspector, you can either agree and make the change. You may have to pull your product off the marketplace, or at least go back to the previous change before the one that triggered the issue. And then until you get a new clearance from the 510K, of the new 510K, which can be another 3-4 months. So recognize those possibilities. But if you have the data, don't be afraid to professionally disagree with the inspector and or the various offices. Of course, once it reaches the center, that's it. And if they uphold the inspector's decision, then you have no choice but to file a 510K. Now, we appreciate the fact that the FDA will generally take about 90 days. Near the end of the 90 days, they will let you know, hey, we need some additional information, or we refuse to review this, refuse to accept, whatever. Usually it's additional information, etc. So it can go a little further. They'll stop the clock until you resubmit, and they'll start the review clock again, up to a maximum of about 180 days. My own personal experience is the FDA is tougher on the 510Ks each year. The reviewers, some of the reviewers aren't overly familiar with the product they're reviewing, has been my feeling. And usually, if that's the case, you're going to get tougher questions. Where reviewers very familiar with that product and its problems in the field, they're a little more willing to accept what you've submitted without challenging a lot of it, because they can see immediately, yes, this does apply, this does not apply, yes, that is an issue, that is not, it's been adequately addressed or has not. So the more knowledgeable a reviewer about your specific product, generally I feel it's a little easier getting it through the process than with somebody who's totally unfamiliar with the process in terms of requests for supplemental information. My own personal opinion. Make sure you have strong data to support your 510K information. Now, there's no such thing as retroactive 510Ks or 510K supplements. I get these questions every once in a while, even now. You have only 3 choices: the traditional, the abbreviated, and the special. And if you're filing a new 510K against your previous 510K, you want to consider either the special or the traditional.